Hey there, and welcome to the Mini Sculpting Super Show, a place where you can come to learn all you need to know about sculpting miniatures. I'm Tom Mason, and today's topic we're going to talk about how to sculpt hoods. Now, this is something that I think is be super helpful to a lot of people, not just miniature sculptors, but also people that are interested in doing conversions and things like that, or just adding little bits to their already existing pieces. It's something that I've seen a lot of tutorials on too, so it was exciting to be able to tackle this myself. But I think I'm going to show you maybe a better way to do it, a better way to think about it that can help you make the hoods look more interesting and natural, I guess. So without further ado, let's get on with the tutorial. The Mini Sculpting Super Show is powered in part by Sculptomo Toys. See everything they have to offer at sculptomotoys.com. So a lot of people treat hoods and hats and hair very similarly when they sculpt a miniature. They make a fully realized designed head, get the full shape there, and then they either stick a big blob of putty on top, or maybe they flatten it out into a shape kind of like what you're seeing right now, and then they stick it on. But the trick with that is that if you just apply the putty, or the clay, in this case, this is FIMO Professional that I'm using, so I can make a lot of modifications as I go, including changing the shape of the head if necessary, but in this tutorial I don't really do that. But the thing you want to remember is that you're not putting on an actual hood. In real life, you've got your head, and then you put on a hood, and it's a very separate, distinct piece of fabric. And the trick to do hoods to where you can have more control over the shape is to actually really, it sounds weird to say this, but just sculpt the shape you want it to be. And as you can see here, I'm starting out, I'm going to create that main hood shape, the part that kind of comes over the head, over the eyes, the really defined main part. And I did do that by flattening out some clay, cutting it down to shape, but you'll notice it's just the front part. And once I stick that on there, I'm going to start blending that into the head. And the reason I do this rather than taking a really big, massive shape, and you'll see this a lot of times in conversions, people do that. They'll just cut out a big shape of putty and lay it onto the miniature, and it just seems really thick and really big and really bulky. And I would challenge you to not do that, to do it this way. Work in smaller pieces, and you can do this whether you're working in putty or FIMO, or polyclay rather, which is FIMO that I'm using. You can put on smaller bits at a time, be a little more controlled about the placement, and you can do a much better job of getting some really interesting and cool shapes. So as you see here, I didn't quite put on enough material that would wrap down around his face, so I'm just kind of fixing and adjusting that, the main hood piece, and then I'm going to add a little bit of clay down more around the chin and neck, just to kind of fill and complete the rest of the shape. Another way to do it is you can do exactly the same thing, but if you just have more material than you need, it's okay, you just trim off that little bit. I kind of mentioned it quickly in passing, but just to reiterate, this sculpture that you're looking at me work on right now is all made with FIMO Professional polyclay, which means, and the way I work is I sculpt pretty much the entire miniature before baking it. So everything you're looking at right here and seeing is soft, malleable clay that I can manipulate or trim off very easily. So I just really like to work that way, and I feel like it gives me a lot of flexibility, allows me to work the entire miniature shape and form at one time, and make adjustments on the fly if something isn't working quite right without feeling quite the permanence of putty. You can do it with putty too, but it will set up on its own, and it will you have a time limit. So which can be a good thing, because sometimes with polyclay, because you have no time limit, you just can work it forever. So here you see I just added a little bit more clay down there to help define and finish the form, the front form. And this is really, like I said, this is the most important part. And this is, well, the whole hood is important, but what I mean by that is you have to take a lot of extra special care on this element, because this is the part that, if you're not careful, can get really gummy and gloppy, and this will kind of really sell what material the hood is made out of. You know, if you just, for instance, if you were sculpting with putty, I see this a lot more with putty than with polyclay, but if you just lay on a slab of putty, it tends to have a very rounded look to it, unless you really know what you're doing and take the time to manipulate it. I actually spent a decent amount of time on this part myself, actually, because there wasn't quite enough understructure with the amount of the hood coming over his face, so I ended up going back and forth a little bit there, just to try and get it right. Now, as I said before, rather than laying a giant piece of medium on top of the head and trying to just physically put a hood over your miniature, you want to use the shape of your head when making the hood. And as you'll see here, I've got the front piece that I just finished sculpting, and now I'm just tacking on a little bit of putty on the back. So basically that entire middle section of the hood is actually just the shape of his head. Now granted, putting on a hood is bulkier than your head, but your head and any anatomy that's underneath clothing informs the shape that the material and the fabric will take. And that's something you just need to take into consideration when you're sculpting. And that's why I like this approach, because it retains the anatomy underneath. And I work this way with clothes and with hair to a good extent as well. You don't need nearly as much material as you think at times. So I'm using my Wax 5 sculpting tool, metal sculpting tool. It's my main tool that I use for most of my sculpting. Right here, now this goblin, obviously he has ears, so, well, most people have ears, but his ears are big, so they're sticking out of the hood. And so I'm adding just a little bit of putty around there. Sometimes if I had a little more bulked in, I could have just cut it in, but I added in a little bit of material around there to kind of show and define where the holes would be cut in the hood for the ears to protrude from. And it adds a lot of fun little dimension and just extra interesting folds and shapes into the hood. So it's not just a flat blob of clay. Now I'm going in and adding a little more on the bottom, and this is again where it's just more building up. You have to start to think about, well, this is fabric on top of the character's head, so where will the material gather and build up and fold? What I had on there initially just looked like made it look like his head was misshaping, because it was just literally these weird shapes protruding off of the head I had sculpted. So there would be, his neck wouldn't be so thin. There would actually be material and fabric building up and gathering around there, especially with the way he's kind of hunched over with his head looking up. That would make the material kind of start to fold up back behind his head around the neck. You'll notice I mostly use metal tools when I sculpt with FIMO. FIMO isn't as sticky as putty like Procreate or green stuff, so you don't really need to use anything. And when I do use a color shaper or a clay shaper like you saw just there, that I actually don't use them that often, but when I do, that's kind of my forceful blending tool. Whereas with putty, that's when you're trying to be really gentle and careful with the putty and not wanting your tool to stick very much. But with polyclay, it's actually the reverse. The silicone tip tends to grab and catch on the clay a little more, and that allows you to kind of pull and drag it a little bit better, whereas the metal tools glide very easily over the clay. Now right there, I'm just kind of trimming off just a little bit, just kind of using my scalpel to really define in that shape of the front of the hood. and you just have to go around and I sculpted a bit of a mantle on the character that is actually what the hood is attached to. I had that on there first, but now you have to make sure that everything kind of blends in and meshes with how it would actually fold and gather around on the character. And I actually really like sculpting cloth. It can be a little tricky, and I don't report to be an expert in making it super hyper realistic, but take some time to study how clothes fold and gather. There's actually a great book. Oh my gosh, I'm gonna forget his name. Bern Hogarth. He's does several different has done several different books on drawing anatomy and different things. And one he did was a book all about how folds work and react. And that was a great resource because it was basically like a diagram of all the different possible ways clothing and material could fold and gather on the human form. Super helpful. But I just love how capes and cloth fold just adds a lot of fun, interesting dynamics to a miniature without, it's not even a lot of detail, but it just seems like it is because of the shapes. So if anybody's been following my channel for any length of time, they might have noticed that this goblin in some ways bears a pretty big resemblance to the 15mm goblin that was some of the first official episodes of the Mini Sculpting Super Show. And I've always wanted to redo and show you guys a hood like this because I did this effect that I'm going to show you now, which is kind of a stitching. It's a great effect you can do in hoods or just any sort of cloth material. It's another very simple detail that just adds a lot to the material. So what I've done is I kind of right there I just cut in a little bit of a line in the front. It's supposed to look like, not the whole thing is two pieces, but maybe it was a flat piece of fabric that was cut in a weird shape that was brought together to create the form of the hood. And now I'm just taking this needle or probe tool, and you could use a scalpel and just cut a very harsh line, but I'm trying to make it a little more subtle. And so I'm just drawing a line out with the probe tool. And now there's several different ways, but this is a nice easy way. Is I'm just kind of cutting in some stitch marks. I'm basically cutting in the side of what would be a piece of string or stitching, cutting in the side lengths of those elements. And when I'm pushing in, I'm actually kind of flicking it out as well to try and bring the putty, the material up, the clay up, to help it look like it's a little more raised. Another way to do it, and I actually think I do that in a second because these seemed a little shallow to me, is you can actually put on some extra bit of material. And that's a great way to, I'm about to do it right here. But after you cut in those two sides with the scalpel, I like to poke it with the probe on each side or a similar small tool, and that just helps add some depth and really makes it look like the string or rope is going into the material and kind of pulling it tight and taut. I really like sculpting this detail. Everybody has kind of a little element and whatnot that they really like and go to, and this is definitely one of mine. I don't use it all the time, but I do kind of look for reasons to use it. Yep, there I go, just kind of redefining those edges again and adding in just a few more folds to kind of sell the fact that these little stitches are holding the hood tight together. And as always, whenever you're sculpting, you always gotta go back into that last second kind of refinement just to make sure everything's lined up. And there you go. That's how you sculpt a hood. So even though this video focused specifically on how to sculpt a hood, I hope this showed you how you can take these techniques and apply it to all sorts of different elements, and how you really just need to focus on building the shape you want rather than laying down what you think something should look like. As always, I'd like to thank everyone for helping support me and the show via Patreon or by heading over to my website and buying some of my miniatures. It's really appreciated. If you'd like to see more videos like this, you can subscribe, hit the like button, and leave a comment below and we can continue the discussion. Thanks for watching, and remember, keep sculpting.